Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show, Red Pill Edition. My name is Leon Jones. And in this segment, I'm going to talk about an unrecognized mental disorder known as Stockholm Syndrome, because it is very important that you hear me when I present this message, because when it comes to mental disorders, a lot of us have them, but we don't even know we don't even know if we have them or not. We have some type of symptom, whether it's schizophrenia, narcissism, whether we're psychopathic, borderline personality disorders, we have some version. But Stockholm Syndrome is very important. And you hear that word going around here in Western society. Now, the title of this video is going to be Stockholm Syndrome: Causes, Symptoms, and Treatment. Stockholm Syndrome: Causes, Symptoms, and Treatments. Now, before I get into the topic, let me give a couple of shout outs. Shout out to Brother Reg the Bad Guy. Shout out to Trey, the NBD, Theo Wolf, Clue, Hoop Jargon, Mr. O, Melly Mel, SKC, Brother Little, Big Nate, Bernard Riley, Mr. Palmer, Brother Ramil, and Mr. Fantastic. Check their channels out. They give good content as well, because here in the manosphere and in the red pill sector, a number of individuals think that all we talk about is women, although women are part of the problem. Here on the 411 Talk Zone radio show, I go a little deeper and talk about psychology, because a woman or a man can look good on the outside. And a lot of us who are men, we lust for good looking women. And of course, women, they lust for good looking men. But what's good on the outside is not necessarily good on the inside. And when we're trying to interact with somebody, we need to look at their actions. We need to ask the right questions. Now, even if you ask the right questions, you're not always going to get the right answer. So you have to look at the actions based on daily patterns. And one aspect of a pattern that you will always discover about someone is their behavior. And behaviors can be quite fluctuatory. You have some people who are hot and cold, indecisive. You have some people that are happy-go-lucky. You have some people that are always angry. You have some people who are always serious. There's a reason why that happens. Number one, it's based on your environment, what your family upbringing is, what your educational background is, what your career is, how much money you have made, and where you want to go in life. Now, in the end, I will say this: doesn't matter how much money you make, doesn't matter your educational level, It doesn't even matter how well you speak. We all have behavioral issues. And my reasons for doing these types of videos here in the red pill sector and Black manosphere is to address a niche known as behavior or psychology. You don't have to be a psychologist to study behavior. I am not a psychologist. I am a civil engineer. My forte is studying infrastructure, dead loads, live loads, designing roads, bridges, and tunnels. But even as engineers, some of us go cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Now, when it comes to Stockholm Syndrome, and I'm going to get more into the definition when I share my screen, Stockholm Syndrome comes from Stockholm, Sweden. And basically, when somebody has Stockholm Syndrome, they could be captured. And the victim, when they are in a predicament, what they do is defend the perpetrator. You've had a few cases. Patty Hearst was one of the examples. That name will come up again in this video, so pay attention. But again, let me break it down to the Black community. And let me tell you something. Occasionally, I get a dislike. For any of you who dislike the video, I understand that you're not able to handle the truth because you're the person that I'm talking about. But I can tell you, the swirler community, they worship the white man. They defend the white man. They think the white man is better than us Black men. Well, you got Stockholm Syndrome. And that's vice versa for your brothers. When you put another race over yourself, not only are you looking up to them with an inferiority complex, because that's another video I'm going to do, and that's going to tie into Stockholm Syndrome, but you defend them at every case. And you defend them so you make Black men and Black women look horrible. But Black folk, I don't hate white folk. I don't hate anybody. Hate's a strong word. But trying to put another race over you, and then you make excuses for that other race, that gives you Stockholm Syndrome, especially your sisters out there. Because during slavery, you got a chance to read and write. Yes, some of you were RAPED just like the men, but a number of you married white men to become free. White men gave you all the perks. But that still doesn't make you better than a Black man, and vice versa. But I see it more with the African American woman. Now, again, I'm not talking about every African American woman, nor am I talking about every African American man. So get out your feelings. Let's use some common sense here. I'm simply talking about a syndrome that allows you as a victim to defend the oppressor. And make no mistake, there are a lot of oppressors. One oppressor that no one talks about is the government. And when you depend on something like the government, you end up defending something like the government because here's the proof. You go and vote for those government programs, particularly women, because women are a huge voting bloc. That could also be a form of Stockholm syndrome, because when you defend the government, you're also defending the corruption of the government. And if you see with both eyes and hear with both ears, you see what's going on with the Afghanistan situation. That's your government. But in the end, when it comes to Stockholm syndrome, a number of us have it. Now, let me share my screen and let's get into this. Okay. When we deal with Stockholm syndrome, we have to ask the $1 million question. What is Stockholm syndrome? I want to tell you right now. And at the end of the video, I will leave the link at the bottom of the video so you can get an idea of where I got the source. And there are more sources out there. What I do is give you a source. And if you want to dig deeper, it is your choice. Please feel free, because what I'm doing is giving you an overview. After all that has been said, let me keep going. So when we talk about Stockholm syndrome, let's define it. Well, Stockholm syndrome is a psychological response that people often associate with infamous kidnappings and hostage situations. See, a person who has Stockholm syndrome develops positive associations with their captors or abusers. Now, this is where it comes to where a victim is actually protecting the person who's the oppressor or the perpetrator. Now, as we know, when we deal with Stockholm syndrome, it is the name for a psychological response to captivity and abuse, because a person who has Stockholm syndrome develops positive associations again with their captors and abusers. Now, one thing I will tell you is that experts, for the most part, don't fully understand this response formation, but think it may serve as a coping mechanism for people who experience trauma. Now, a person who has Stockholm syndrome or who develops Stockholm syndrome, what happens during that time is they experience significant threats to their physical or psychological well-being. For instance, a kidnapped person may develop positive associations with their captors if they have face-to-face contact with them. Now, for the person who has experienced physical abuse from their captors, what will happen is they may feel some gratitude when the abuser treats them humanly or does not physically harm them. Now, a person may also attempt to appease, appease, and that's a word too when it comes to the Democratic Party, the LGBTQ, the feminists, the simps. They all have one thing in common. They're appeasers. Even you have some Republicans, they're also appeasers. I'm just going to put individuals who have a large bank account can be appeasers because they can make money off of people's misfortunes. You look at the race hustlers, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, and I want to say this. My prayers are for Reverend Jesse Jackson and his wife. I don't have to agree with his politics, but I don't want anything to happen to either of them. They were hospitalized last week due to COVID 19. Now, back to the topic. Again, when it comes to somebody who has Stockholm syndrome, and I want to say this as well, they may appease their oppressor or their subject for personal safety. Because let's be honest, if you are captured, you're definitely going to be afraid. So you have to find some way to survive. And the best way to survive when you are in a situation of captivity is you may have to appease the oppressor. Now, this strategy can positively reinforce the idea that they may be better off working with an abuser or captive. This could be another factor behind the development of Stockholm syndrome. Now, when it comes to Stockholm syndrome, a vast majority of captives and survivors of abuse do not develop Stockholm syndrome. And of course, mental health experts do not recognize Stockholm syndrome as an official mental health disorder. So as a result, it is not listed in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the book that classifies all of the mental disorders. That is known as DSM 5. 5 is the 5th edition. Now, when it comes to Stockholm syndrome, we have to find out where it came from. So, when we go back and look at Stockholm syndrome, I'll say this: criminologist and psychiatrist Niels Bergerud originally coined the term Stockholm syndrome to explain the aftermath of a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, back in 1973. Because on August 23rd, 1973, Jan Erik Olsen attempted to rob the Norrmalmstorg Bank, and during a robbery, Olsen took 4 bank employees: Brigida Lundblad, Elizabeth Ogren, Kristen Enmark, and Sven Safstrom. They were taken hostage. And again, 4 bank employees. And they were scared to death. Now, I will say this: if you have never been in a hostage situation, many of us would not know what to do, because it's easy to sit on a sideline and talk about what we could do, but in the long run, we have never been in a situation. It is a scary situation. Now, when it came to this bank robbery, later on, Olsen's former cellmate, Chuck Olofsson, joined the robbery. So the 2 remained inside of the bank with 4 hostages. Then the situation developed into a 6-day standoff with police. Now, after the hostages released, the authorities found that they had developed strong emotional bonds for their captors. And after that, the hostages reported that Olson and Alston treated them kindly and they did not physically harm them. In fact, they defended their captors and refused to testify against them. Now, Alston even displayed positive feelings toward the hostages. And this is generally what happens in some situations. And I believe the swirling community, when it comes to worshiping another race, because they don't deem us brothers good men. And sometimes it happens on the other side with the brothers and the Caucasian women. They make excuses. Even if that white man or that white woman is not up to par, is trashy. Because a lot of times when we look at Stockholm syndrome, there's a little bit of denial within Stockholm syndrome, because what I've given you was the origins of Stockholm syndrome. But what happens if you've never been captured? Can you still have Stockholm syndrome? I believe you can. Now, when it comes to Stockholm syndrome, just like any other disease, behavioral issue, there are causes, because many researchers, psychologists, and criminologists really don't fully understand Stockholm syndrome, and some continue to debate whether it exists at all. Yes, since Stockholm syndrome is not recognized by the DSM-5, it is a complex issue, because we developed Stockholm syndrome from what happened during the bank robbery in 1973. However, experts believe that Stockholm syndrome can develop. Again, hear me out. Stockholm syndrome can develop when, number one, the captor or the perpetrator treats their victims with humanity. The perpetrators or captors have significant face-to-face interaction, which basically provides opportunities to bond with one another. Now, here's the problem with that. You may get some loony bin that will bond with the victims, get the victims comfortable, and these loons could still murder the victims. That has also happened. Now, also the captors feel that law enforcement personnel, such as the police, they feel that the personnel of law enforcement are not doing their jobs well enough. And also, a captive thinks that police and other authorities do not have their best interest at heart. Now, there's also a chance where the perpetrators want sympathy as well. Now, you just heard the causes. Flipping back, what about the symptoms? Because Stockholm syndrome can manifest in several ways, including when the victims perceive kindness and compassion from their captor or abuser. Stockholm syndrome can manifest when the victims develop positive feelings toward the individual or group of individuals holding them captive or abusing them. They also adopt the same goals, worldviews, and ideology as captors or abusers. Of course, there's pity felt between the captors or abusers. There's also a chance that there's refusal to leave the captors, and this is by the victims, even when the opportunity of escape is granted to them. There's also negative perceptions toward police, family, friends, and everyone else who may try to help them escape the situation. Now, again, there's some denial, and it is happening because they weren't harmed. And there's also refusal to assist police and government authorities in persecuting perpetrators of abuse or kidnapping. And the problem with this is the perpetrators, although they may have let the victims of the bank robbery get away, there's a chance that the next people they capture won't be so lucky. Now, here's something that you need to know. During a bank robbery, after the release, or if you've had some other capture or terrible situation, but it involved someone else who made you a victim, who put you in a position where you had to worship them, or they're going to take your life. Well, any person with Stockholm syndrome may continue to have positive feelings toward their captor. However, they may experience flashbacks, depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. You see, when I do a lot of these disorders, there's going to be some connection with other disorders. Now, although there is no clear definition of Stockholm syndrome, experts have linked it to other psychological phenomena associated with abuse, such as trauma bonding, battered person syndrome, and of course, learned helplessness. And I can call that denial because in a 2018 study, researchers attempted to establish an association between Stockholm syndrome and sex trafficking. And during that time, the researchers reviewed personal accounts from female sex workers living in India. And the narratives included in the study that describe several conditions that have associations with Stockholm syndrome. And they include perceived threats to physical and psychological survival, perceived kindness from the trafficker or client, isolation from the outside world, and there was a perceived inability to escape. Now, according to study authors, some of the women expressed that they had at one time hoped to start a family with their trafficker or client. Now, just to prove to you that it exists or there was captivity by a perpetrator, we talk about what happened during a bank robbery in 1973. And some examples. There was Mary McElroy, 1933, 4 decades before the bank robbery in Sweden. 4 men kidnapped Mary McElroy, and the kidnappers released her after receiving $30,000 in ransom that they demanded. Although Mary McElroy agreed that her captors should receive punishment, she sympathized with them and even visited them in prison. Now, when I was younger, a lot was heard about Patty Hearst, 1974. I was 9 years old. Now, shortly after the Stockholm incident, members of a left-wing militant group called the United Federation Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army, known as SLA, kidnapped 19-year-old Patty Hearst from her apartment in Berkeley, California. 12 days after the kidnapping, Hearst was involved in a bank robbery alongside members of the SLA. So according to Hearst, the SLA had brainwashed her and forced her to join them. Then the FBI arrested Hearst, September 18th, 1975, they gave her, and that was 18 months after the kidnapping. Now, because she was involved in that bank robbery, Hearst received a 7-year prison sentence. So President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence in 1979, and she eventually received a pardon. And there was one that was pretty much recent. Natasha Campish, 1998. Well, what happened was Wolfgang Pricklepil kidnapped 10-year-old Natasha Campish and isolated her in a cellar for more than 8 years. Pricklepil beat her and threatened her life. He also bought her gifts and fed and bathed her. Campish cried after hearing that Pricklepil had died by suicide. Now, this person was held for 8 years. Something else went on. And there is proof that the victims do bond with their perpetrators. Now, I do believe that some of it is for survival, some of it is for denial, because you have individuals that don't believe the perpetrator did anything bad. But when you sympathize for the perpetrator, all you're doing is giving him carte blanche to go out and repeat the same crime. And I said earlier, when that happens, the next crime that they commit, and there are hostages involved, the hostages may not be lucky or as lucky as the previous ones. So moving back on to the story. Campish tried to explain her relationship with Pricklepil to interviewers, but they basically wrote her off, claiming that she had Stockholm Syndrome. So in an interview with the Guardian newspaper, Campish said, "I find it very natural that you would adapt yourself to identify with your kidnapper, especially if you spend a great deal of time with that person." Well, it can happen because, first of all, you didn't have any other people around you and you were isolated with that person. Now, when it comes to Stockholm Syndrome, there is treatment for it. And that's why you heard in the beginning the title being Stockholm Syndrome, Origins, Causes, and Treatment, or I call it Symptoms, Causes, and Treatment. Because in order for it to be treated, you have to identify the symptoms, but you have to know where it came from. And this is what we're trying to find out with the 19. Now, when it comes to treatment, again, Stockholm Syndrome is an unrecognized psychological disorder, and it does not have a standard definition. So as a result, there is no official treatment recommendations for it. However, psychotherapy and medication can help relieve issues associated with trauma recovery, such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So when it comes to treatments, people can work with a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist. And what will happen is a psychiatrist can prescribe medications that may help alleviate mood disorder symptoms. And psychologists and licensed mental health counselors can help people develop strategies and tools to use when trying to understand and work with their experiences. Again, Stockholm Syndrome is very, very, it's very, very tough to deal with, because there may not be a recognized disorder of Stockholm syndrome, but like I said, it leads to some real disorders. And PTSD, which you can follow that with depression and anxiety, are always going to follow. Why? Because you're going to remember that night when something happened. And that's going to be with you the rest of your life, even when you get help. But when it comes to Stockholm syndrome, we'll summarize it here. It's a rare psychological reaction to captivity and, in some instances, abuse. Feelings of fear, terror, and anger towards a captor or abuser may seem more realistic to most people. However, in extreme situations such as kidnapping, a person may develop positive feelings towards the captor as a coping mechanism when they feel that their physical and mental well-being is at stake. Also, experts, they do not recognize Stockholm syndrome as a mental health disorder. So people who have been abused, trafficked, or kidnapped may experience it. But people who have Stockholm syndrome may also experience symptoms of anxiety, depression, or PTSD. Again, proper treatment can help improve a person's recovery so they can move forward. Again, when we deal with Stockholm syndrome, one must understand that the term Stockholm syndrome is the name for a psychological response to captivity and abuse. It's terrible. And if you haven't been in that situation, you would not even know about it. I've never been in that situation, but I can imagine how frightened somebody is. Now, again, Stockholm syndrome is not recognized. However, I just want to say this. When you allow yourself to take up for the abuser, now I'm going to give an exception to the rule, and this is when it comes to survival, because you only live one time. But I can tell you, there are a number of African American people who were in slavery, and they're still in mental slavery today, because you have some of them that defend their oppressors, and while you have others who still think that they're victims. But when we turn around and look at ourselves as a race, we've had a lot come against us. And I will say this, civil rights, and this is carte blanche key, and I have to salute Black folk for doing this. If it weren't for Black folk, you wouldn't have had the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, or any of these other movements. The problem is, some of us Blacks want white people to like us. We want to curry to them, appease them. Well, if we do that, we look inferior. And when it comes to us as Black people, when it comes to a community, we don't have a community. Many of your educated Blacks don't live around other Blacks. They live in a white community. They think it's better. And in a number of instances, it is because of the types of lifestyles. But I will say this. to Black men and Black women. Don't for one moment think that they're going to be on your side. Because at the drop of a dime, they could have you put out your own neighborhood if they didn't like you. Now, again, it's not all white folk. And to some white folk too, with this BLM, feeling guilty, that's also putting yourself in a inferior position too, because you're made to feel guilty. And I know not all white folk had slaves, but just because you share the skin, you're going to be looked at as a slave owner. And see, when you have a media out here and you have politicians who keep stirring up the pot, the media, politicians, they're going to keep creating people with the victimhood mindset who have Stockholm syndrome. And what we have to do when it comes to any disorder is we have to try to treat it. But in order to treat it, we have to understand what that disorder is, or a behavioral issue, since Stockholm syndrome is not really recognized as a mental disorder. In the end, no matter if you're Black, white, if you're having issues, I would seek help. Because as you heard me mention Stockholm syndrome leads to other real disorders. I mean, depression is big, anxiety, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are symptoms that are very serious. And they will stick with you for the rest of your life if you don't take heed and get help. And I will say this again with our Black people. There's nothing wrong with getting help. We're all human. I know some of us may not have that income to get help, but I'm sure there are clinics out there. Because when you have Stockholm syndrome, when you have anxiety, any type of behavioral disorder, it always keeps your environment dysfunctional. And an issue like molestation, which is abuse, that's going to keep you thinking about what happened through post-traumatic stress disorder. And, a number of women and men who have been molested, particularly when they were young, if they don't get help, they're going to have a lot of problems pair bonding. And in the end, they're going to have so much dysfunction, they're either going to be alone or commit suicide. And suicide is another issue as well. You see, we're all human. We're not perfect. But in the end, when it comes to any problem, whether it's alcoholism, whether you have a sex addiction, whether you have borderline personality disorder, a lot of these can come from Stockholm syndrome. And Stockholm syndrome again, came from Stockholm, Sweden. And that happens when somebody is held hostage. Can you imagine yourself being in the bank, being in the school? Your life is always threatened. And being able to talk to the perpetrators may save your life. It may not. And that's why I mentioned Stockholm syndrome as having the tools to appease your perpetrator or oppressor because you're in the moment. You have instincts. Because you don't know what that perpetrator is going to do. But that's Stockholm syndrome taken from captivity. But when you feel inferior to someone like another race who has held you captive, but then you constantly defend them. And if you look at what slavery has done to Black people, and some of you are going to dislike this video, that's fine, but you know it's true. Because there are a number of us, African Americans, still in slavery. We can't even get along with each other because the oppressor didn't want us to get along with each other. Because if we did, we would have a strong alliance. So what did the oppressor do? They used the government. Black women went ahead and got on board feminism. And you look at them now, they agree with the LGBTQ. They don't agree with having a family. A family is a good structure if it's operating properly. Trying to do it alone, you're going to have to find ways to survive. It's not easy out here, particularly if you're a woman trying to do it all on your own, especially when you get older. Because what do you have to live on? If you didn't work a great job, you're not going to have a lot of retirement. But what I am going to say as a man, yes, you can live alone, but a number of us men don't go to the doctor to get our health checked out either. We're bullheaded. Many of us will say, well, we don't need a doctor. And the only time we go to a doctor is when it's too late. And I'm going to say this. Stockholm syndrome, although it's not recognized by the DSM-5, it is real. Any one of us could run into Stockholm syndrome. Now, from the examples I gave, from the article, I understand what the victims had to do. But what I don't understand is if you're not a victim, of course, here in the manosphere, you got one side that's willing to deal with the oppressor while at the same time putting men of their own race down. To me, that's sort of Stockholm syndrome or an inferiority complex. And you have the brothers who are doing the same thing. Now, my suggestion is for all of you who are putting your own race down, you need to seek help. Because I don't care if you have all the money in the world. You can date who you want. You can put each other down as black people, but in the end, you're still black, no matter what. Now, we don't have to live around each other. We don't have to like each other. But understand that we have issues. A number of us are narcissistic. We're in denial. A number of us have borderline personality disorders. A number of us come from good backgrounds and bad backgrounds. But I will tell you this. As humans, we have to understand, particularly living here in America, that we have to, for the most part, live around each other. And with an influx of immigrants coming in, we're going to have to beef up our security. We're even going to have to do more studies on mental disorders. Why? Because even those immigrants coming in have mental disorders as well. They're also bringing in COVID. They're also bringing in other diseases as well. Now, I've gone off track a little bit, but I'm just giving you the real truth here. When it comes to therapy, we all need therapy. But it takes a real man and a woman to admit first that they have a problem. And once you notice you have a problem, you explain your problem, then you seek help. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to living your life, do you want to live in normalcy, or do you want to continue to live in dysfunction? Because if you live a normal, prosperous life, it's going to be a lot easier for you to gain access to opportunities. However, if you live in dysfunction, you're always going to have problems. And the problems are going to come mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit the Cash App at the bottom of my videos, because this information that I'm giving you, although it is free, little donation keeps me motivated to do more of this psychological content, because what I'm doing is giving you an overview of what the symptom is. And once you understand the symptom, you can take it to a professional where they can give you the help that you need. Also, if you are looking for some educational information in science, technology, engineering, and math, check out my other YouTube channel, The Mind of STEM. On that channel, we'll give you a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. And on that channel, you're going to hear subjects like cybersecurity, etymology, mechanical engineering, and calculus. And I am working on doing panels. I may combine the panel and blog talk radio at the same time. I'm looking at doing panels on Monday and Wednesday, because, like I'm saying, got to give a shout out to brother Little Big Nate, and TPOT, because I get on their panels as well. And I want to make sure I don't interfere with their panels, but also going to want them to come over here to the 411 Talk Zone radio show and join my panel when I have it. Also, when it comes to Blog Talk Radio, Blog Talk Radio calling number is 215-383-5785. Now, if you cannot find me on YouTube or Blog Talk Radio, you can simply find me on Twitter, MeWe, and Parler. Now, speaking of other platforms, I post all of my videos from the 401 Talk Zone radio show on Twitter, MeWe, and Parler, while I post my Mind the STEM videos on Twitter. And the reason why I do that, Parler and MeWe are more or less political channels. So the Mind the STEM wouldn't quite fit in the realm of politics. Now, I'm cutting the mustard barely with the psychological videos, but with what we got going on in politics today, a number of these politicians do need some therapy because their decision making is poor. Their decision making is making us look weak. And at the end of the day, I'm going to leave you with this. Be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Always know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And as for individuals who are listening to my video, and I want to say this, whether you like the content or dislike the content, if it doesn't apply, let it fly. But the shoe fits, you wear it. If you don't like the shoe, then just change it. And once again, that's my commentary of Stockholm Syndrome right here on the 401 Talk Zone radio show. And I want to thank you once again for taking time out to view this information. Until next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful and gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.